So, how would you define capitalism?
How would I define capitalism? I would define it very simply as the ability of individuals to freely make contracts with each other without significant state intervention in doing so. There are a lot of different definitions out there that are far more complex. We had Deirdre McCloskey, the economic historian at the ASI, the other night, and she prefers innovism, saying that actually it's more about the ability of people to innovate free of government structure and free of restrictions on free speech, for example, that is the driving force behind it. But yeah, to me, it's freedom of contract, basically. That's the most important thing.
Why do you think capitalism is good?
I mean, I think it's good because it leads to better outcomes for people in terms of living happier, more fulfilled lives than any other system that has been tried, and any other hypothetical system that has been proposed. It's been tested in the fires of the real world for several hundred years, in various degrees. Obviously, we've never had a completely capitalist society, but to the degree that we have had capitalism, it has made our lives better, and that's why I support it. I do not support capitalism because I think that there is a thing called rights out there that must be respected, even if it means that we all live horrible, miserable lives. And if someone was able to convince me that socialism was improve people's well-being, and well-being obviously a hard term to define, but if it improves people's well-being more than any other system, I would become a socialist. But I'm very convinced for many different reasons that that will never happen.
So, how would you define socialism?
Socialism is a difficult one because there's a thousand definitions out there, and depending on what brand of socialist you are. Broadly speaking, it would be a belief in extreme levels of government control of the economy, whether that's through nationalization or indeed total collectivization, and thinking that that is the best way of improving the lot of the proletariat and the working class. And again, I do not think that is historically been true or will ever be true.
Before you talked about the government having a limited role in terms of capitalism, what should the government's role be?
So I think very simply, the government's role should be to maximize the competitiveness of markets that currently exist and then redistribute in the most efficient way the proceeds of tax revenue from that market, to help people on low incomes. And I don't think there's too much of a role for government in other areas. Arguably, making sure that any sort of negative externalities are properly accounted for. So pollution, climate change would be a case where I think there's government intervention, and that it's justified in certain areas. But overall, I don't think there should be very much at all. And maybe in the far-flung future, once we've colonized Mars, we can experiment with some no government societies as well.
Do you think capitalism is exploitative?
No, I don't think it's exploitative. A good example of why I don't think it is would be in the field of sex work regulation, which is something that I've done a fair amount of research on. And the argument that tends to come up there, is that because, say, someone is on very low income, and they aren't able to, for various reasons, get another job, so they turn to sex work as a way of making sure that they have enough to eat and enough to pay rent. And people would often argue, and I think understandably so, that that is an exploitative situation. Uh, the issue there is that you have to compare it to the counterfactual, which is that if you did not allow that transaction or that activity to take place, if you, say, banned sex work or you made it so difficult that it was almost impossible to do, then the alternative is that that person would have no job and no way of paying their rent or of putting food on the table. So I think exploitation is one of those concepts where it's difficult to it's difficult to really justify describing something as exploitation when the alternative is going to be worse.
A lot of free market capitalists say that socialism doesn't work, but the socialists point towards more nationalised systems like the NHS, for example, which a lot of Britons say is the best thing about the country. How would you respond to that?
the NHS is not a good healthcare system. Internationally speaking, it is on the lower end of most league tables, and certainly when it comes to things like cancer survival rates, most European-style social insurance systems are far more effective. They still provide universal coverage, and they don't have the same national religion following them that we, for some silly reason, do in Britain. Another thing that gets confused with this is if you criticize the NHS as a bad system or a bad way of managing healthcare, people will assume that you therefore dislike the staff that work for the NHS, which is, of course, complete nonsense. But the NHS has not been an example of a successful socialist system. If you look at waiting lists in the UK, if you try to get a doctor's appointment, I think most people intuitively have some grasp of this. And actually, I think in the wake of COVID-19, they're not beginning to question the NHS by and large. I think that's perhaps wishful thinking from free marketers like myself, but they are beginning to question just in general whether the healthcare in this country is working as well as it should. And the response that will often be pointed to is, well, we just need to put more money into the NHS. The NHS has a fairly average level of funding compared to a lot of other developed countries in terms of how much as a percentage of GDP we spend on it. And yet we are not getting very good outcomes. So to me, no, that's not a good example of socialism. The other one that gets pointed to a lot is Scandinavia, where I think you cannot describe that in most ways as a socialist system. In a lot of ways, they're more free market societies than us. If you look at Sweden, it has hardly any national curriculum, for example, when it comes to education. Until recently in Denmark, the fire service was privatized. They don't have national minimum wages. They do it on a regional basis instead, according to collective bargaining. So there's a lot of ways in which I think people will point to a system and say this is socialism doing very well. And then you look into the detail, and either it's actually socialism doing very badly, or it's not socialism at all.
Do you think that we will still have the NHS in 20 or 30 years? Because currently there's high waiting lists. People aren't happy with the treatment, and I'm worried that it will become like the situation with Margaret Thatcher and the mines, for example, where this situation wasn't addressed because of the political incentive, so it just keeps building up and building up and building up, and then someone will have to respond to it, and it might not be as nice as we want it, and people will have to suffer. Do you think the NHS will have to go eventually because of these terrible consequences of nationalised healthcare? And what do you think that will look like?
I think it's possible, but unlikely, certainly in that time frame. I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to the NHS, as I think a lot of my free market colleagues are as well. We just generally think that there is no real way of politically moving towards a system. And as you say, a situation might arise where things get so bad that you kind of get a shock doctrine situation, right, where someone absolutely has to. But I don't see the political incentives really ever reaching that point, and not for the next 20, 30 years, certainly. I think what will happen first is we'll put more and more money into it. We might tinker around the edges with some reforms that might alleviate some pressure. But we'll put a lot more money into it before we really start to consider that maybe we need to move to a different system. I think that the UK, generally most people are far too wedded to the idea of the NHS. Maybe a generational shift will occur. I haven't seen polling on different generations' attitudes towards the NHS, but just purely anecdotally, it seems like there's more appreciation of why the NHS might not be a great system amongst younger people. I hope that's true, and I hope that I'm wrong, and that actually the optimists amongst us free marketers will win out. I just do not think that that's likely to happen, and there are other areas where we have, as a kind of free market movement, more chance to make a difference in the short term.